Okay, so we're live now.
Hello everyone, welcome to ESMARConf2023 and this workshop on screening studies for eligibility in evidence synthesis. My name is Viviana Betancourt. This workshop is being live streamed to YouTube and has a group of participants also taking part live. A very warm welcome to all of you. If you have any questions for our presenter today, you can ask them via the ES Hackathon Twitter account by commenting on the tweet about this workshop. Also, if you registered for the workshop, you can ask your question here on Zoom in the Q&A facility, or you can open your mic and ask the presenter directly. You can also comment in the chat and chat with other participants on our dedicated Slack channel. This should have been sent along with your registration information as well. We will endeavor to answer all your questions as soon as possible. Also, we would like to take time to draw your attention to the code of conduct. This is available at the ESMARConf website at www.esmarconf.org. Our workshop presenter today is Jacqui Eales from the European Centre for Environment and Human Health at the University of Exeter. She's also a research scientist at the Earthwatch Institute. Jacqui, over to you.
Thanks, Bibiana, and a very warm welcome to everyone, and I hope you enjoyed this workshop. So this is a workshop which is really aimed at people who don't necessarily have a full knowledge of the systematic review process, perhaps just starting a review, relatively new, or perhaps you'd just like to know more about the process itself. It can also be useful for people who have done this before and would like some tips. As we go along, I'll be hopefully answering some of your questions. And at this point, it's quite a good time to say that please do interrupt me with questions. There are lots of options, as Bibiana just said, to ask those questions, lots of methods. But for those of you in the meeting today, please do feel free to unmute, to put up your hands, whichever you prefer to do, and just to really interact with this session, because I think it's a really good opportunity to ask those pressing questions. Now, so as many of you know, systematic processes for deciding which studies to include is a key stage in any evidence synthesis. And this workshop's really going to present the key principles of screening, which are to be transparent and objective, with using some worked examples, some exercises, and as I said, lots of opportunities for those questions. So the importance of transparency, we're going to cover that. We'll also go through how to design eligibility criteria. So what should you be including in your eligibility criteria? What should you not? Any of the common pitfalls that many people fall into and how we can avoid these. And also what tools, softwares and new developments there might have been in recent years. There are quite a few of these available to aid the screening process, and these are just becoming more and more. A quick look on SR Toolbox will show you that there are plenty of softwares which are being developed, all of which have their pros and cons, and many of us have our favourites and our not so favourites. So we'll be looking at some of those a bit later as well. And also, this is a good opportunity for any of you who are working on some tools, perhaps using maybe using text mining to help aid the screening process. It's an opportunity for you to talk about what you're doing as well in your work. So please do feel free to unmute and pop things in the chats. But really, I do want to make sure that you have covered the key questions which you have burning. So what if I can't make a decision on a particular study? I can't find a full text, or how detailed should you go with eligibility criteria? Now, these are some of the key questions which often come up when doing screening for systematic reviews and other evidence syntheses, and we'd like to be able to cover those as we go along. So please do shout out. So in the process of doing an evidence synthesis, article screening or eligibility screening or study inclusion, they often get called the same things, is one of the most time-consuming processes in conducting your evidence synthesis. So in some cases, there can be tens of thousands of search results which need to be screened at the title or title and abstract stage, leaving several thousands of abstracts to be screened. And this can lead you to hundreds of full texts which need to be found, retrieved, read, assessed, and then carried through to the next stage. But we know that this stage, this screening stage, is really vital to ensure that all of the relevant evidence that we can find is included, and that the really carefully curated balance of sensitivity and specificity in the search which was designed doesn't go to waste. So during this session, we're going to discuss some techniques that might help us save time during screening as well. So the screening process. Now we have our search results, which we've carefully curated and put into perhaps one library of references. Perhaps if you've got a lot of grey literature, it's not possible to do that. You have to put it in manually. So there might be several different libraries you're having to look at. You've removed duplicates where possible. You've checked the web, you've checked organisational websites, and you've retrieved all the grey literature you can. You are now ready to start the screening process. And perhaps I should say at this point also that it's not necessarily that this screening process is standalone. It might be that it bleeds into other parts of the reviews. I'm doing a particular review at the moment where I have, I'm doing a lot of snowballing, which is where we're looking at the reference lists of existing articles to see if there are any more relevant ones. So it's kind of like a snowballing technique or a pearl growing technique sometimes. And this is going on all the time. Every time that I'm including a study, I need to go and look at the reference list of those that study and do forwards and sometimes backwards citation chasing. So this screening process can be really iterative. And of course, if you've done reviews before, you might know that screening and testing screening or scoping is part of the developing a protocol stage. So once you launch yourself into the full stage of screening, it might be that you've already had some experience of doing it because you've already done some screening in your protocol development. So the question we're trying to answer here is really, how do we decide which of our studies are eligible for inclusion in this review? Well, first of all, it's quite useful to underline the importance of transparency. Now, this, of course, carries throughout the whole of the systematic review process or evidence synthesis process, and particularly in the screening stage. It means that our methods are easy to understand, and whilst we're going through that, once we're undertaking the methods, but also for people who are going back and reading those methods later. We can prove that the methods were followed by being detailed and transparent about how they were undertaken. We can go back to particular articles. You may have a situation where there may have been a so-called mistake made in screening, where, so an example is where an author has come to you and said, well, I know that you're doing this evidence synthesis in this topic area. Have you seen my paper? And you look at the paper and you think, oh, that's really relevant. Well, have we missed it somehow? Has it been not picked up in the search? If it had been picked up in the search, it would have gone through to screening. And that's where it can be really useful to find out what happened to this particular article. Why was it screened out? And that's where transparency can be really important. So keeping really meticulous methods, I can't underline that enough due to a painful personal experience. And it also helps updates to be undertaken, updates to your evidence synthesis. Sometimes that's needed to be done before publication. It can also be a lot more efficient by being transparent. So you've often got many search results, and by keeping proper records, that's the only way to keep track of what's going on in your review. By using a preset number of eligibility criteria across different stages of screening, this can really help us be much more efficient. And we'll talk a lot more about what those eligibility criteria might be later on. And it also enables the full reporting of decisions and these to be openly accessible for future work. So we try to make these open access, particularly when it comes to the full text screening decisions. General recommendations from most of the evidence synthesis guidelines are that decisions made at full text should be presented somewhere so that they can be traceable. And of course, not forgetting the importance of objectivity in any evidence synthesis. So this is following the key systematic review principle of trying to be as objective as possible. And of course, we know that there is a degree of subjectivity that creeps in, but it's about being transparent about what you've done so that we can assess whether a review has been done to different levels of objectivity. So during the screening process, this is where we're really trying to minimize the risk of selection bias and also the differences in selection bias between different reviewers. And this comes in by having multiple reviewers, multiple rounds of consistency checking between reviewers. And this is also known as inter-rater reliability as well. And on that point where we've got multiple terms, yeah, I just wanted to put this up here because I find, well, I certainly found when I started doing systematic reviews, systematic maps, that there was quite a lot of terminology flying around and I wasn't necessarily sure what each of those meant. And it turned out that quite a lot of them were meaning exactly the same thing. So I just wanted to put this slide up here and kind of go through some of these. And this is particularly important, perhaps if English isn't your first language. So screening and relevance assessment, this describes the stage that we're talking about, the article screening stage, sometimes called relevance assessment. A reviewer and a screener, that's essentially the same person if they're undertaking this process. So you can use those, you can see those terms used interchangeably. And sometimes these terms will be used interchangeably across the methods section of one particular paper if you're reading an evidence synthesis paper. So yeah, it can be quite confusing. Inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria, relevance criteria, eligibility criteria. These are all the same thing as well, essentially. Although I would say that inclusion and exclusion criteria are set into two separate, you might see them as columns in a table. So you might have a list of study examples or parts or facets of a study which would denote a relevant review study, and then you might have a list of those which would denote a excluded study, a study that's not relevant. So that's where those two differ between those and relevance and eligibility criteria. And then we've got inter-rater reliability, inter-reviewer reliability or consistency checking, or the level of agreement, essentially. This is how consistent each screener is in looking at the studies. So you might have a test set of, say, 100 studies, and you'll see which reviewers on which studies was there difference in opinion as to whether that study should be included or excluded. And then we've got eligible and relevant. These mean the same thing, essentially, a study that is to be included in the review. Scoping and testing, I've put these as similar or the same things because, yeah, typically scoping is a testing phase of the review, and we often talk about this when we're doing screening. We do a scoping stage to test out your eligibility criteria and also to train systematic reviewers as well. And then in the last row, we've got record, article, and studies. And these are referring to the documents that you're looking at and you're rating. But it might also be that within one article, there might be multiple studies. There might be the case where you have one study which is reported by multiple articles. So that's the difference between those two. But then we've also got record, and record is something that you might have come across if you're doing a lot of searching. So this is your search hits, whatever that is that you get back from your search strategy. You might have 9,000 hits, and each of those hits would be a record. So I hope that's cleared up some terminology. Just a quick pause to see if anyone's got any questions yet. Great.
So far, there are no questions on the chat, no questions on Twitter, and no questions on Slack. I'm not sure if the participants may want to open their mic and probably ask you something directly.
Yeah. So do feel free to open up your mics. Any questions? We're just getting into the meat of this work now. So let's move on to eligibility criteria. So at this stage, at the screening stage, any of your articles, the screening should be undertaken according to particular eligibility criteria. And the aim really of having this set of criteria is that each article should be judged on the basis of a set or predefined set of criteria, which should avoid selection bias as much as possible. And this is one of the, I would say this is one of the major criticisms of traditional reviews is selection bias. It's where the authors have or have not, sometimes just have not reported how they've decided to include studies in reviews. So it's a really important stage to be transparent and repeatable at, and for you to be able to make your decisions in an as objective way as possible. So we need to treat all articles in the same way. It should be repeatable, and any articles which are should be included on the basis of their relevance, not on the significance of their results. And this particularly comes in when you're reading full texts of papers. Sometimes it's a good tip to try and avoid reading the results section of any full texts until after inclusion, because then we're removing the possibility for subconscious changes in our behaviour. And sometimes this isn't possible when you're looking at abstracts and the articles report the results and the conclusions in the abstracts, but that's certainly been something that's been talked about. So we're assessing each potentially relevant record or article against this set of eligibility criteria. And it also helps us to prevent changes in our inclusion decisions over time, because sometimes we get what's called decision drift, which is where anyone, despite your best intentions, interprets the eligibility criteria differently as time goes on. Now, there may be points at which the eligibility criteria do need to be altered as time goes on, and that sometimes that comes because only after a certain point do you realise that there's a set of studies, or there's another type of outcome which is being reported by studies which wasn't necessarily picked up on when you were doing the scoping or the protocol development. So hopefully that shouldn't happen, because you should have done comprehensive scoping. But if it does, that any changes should be recorded to eligibility criteria. And how do we define them? Well, we often usually base them on aspects of the review question's key elements. So the typical PICO question, the population, intervention, comparator, and outcome. But also, and I would recommend that you would also base them on things like the study design, perhaps the location, the geographical location, perhaps the date. There might be date limiters as well that you want to, but also you do need to make sure that you justify any of these limitations. Why should it be a particular region or date? And that will come through not within the eligibility criteria themselves, but in the description in your report. So let's have a look at an example of this eligibility criteria. This is kind of taken from a review which was undertaken several years ago now, but I've tweaked it a little bit. So in this example, the systematic review was trying to answer the question whether marine protected areas were effective tools for sustainable fisheries management. So we're really looking at the biodiversity impact of marine protected areas, so areas of marine reserves sometimes. And this was actually in temperate zones. so in those areas. So the study eligibility criteria, we have listed the key points about those criteria here. So the population of any study should have included, could include any of the marine biota. The intervention was a marine protected area in a temperate area. Now you might actually say that the temperate part could actually fall into the population as well, or it could just sit on its own as geographical location. That doesn't really matter. The comparator, they wanted to include less protected or unprotected areas to compare the protected areas with. And then the outcome was a measure of the biodiversity impact. So that's here, density, abundance measures, biomass, species richness. And also, they've also got study design here as well. So each study should have been a primary study collecting empirical research. Now, this is another point, just an interesting point actually, because I think there are some differences in how people perceive what empirical research is. So typically for me, it's something where the authors of the study, the researchers went and deliberately collected research for their own purposes. But it might also, for some people, this means a re-evaluation or a reinterpretation of existing evidence. So I've seen this happen in different fields where there's a bit of a difference in interpretation, even on things like study design, which I thought were quite well recognized as the same thing. So it's definitely important to make sure that there's consistency and understanding across the whole of your research team. So this is one of the questions that often comes up. How detailed should you go with your eligibility criteria? Now, the example that we had back here is actually not very detailed at all. It's really basic. And I just wanted to show you that because we've got an exercise using that in a few slides' time. And to give you an idea of how it is to undertake assessments when you don't necessarily know the details of the eligibility criteria. In a short answer to this question, I would say as detailed as possible. And sometimes this detail might need to be added in as you go along the review. So as an example, I have taken a screenshot this morning because I didn't know whether this was actually quite difficult to understand how detailed you should go. Okay, so these are 6 pages of inclusion criteria for one systematic map that I was undertaking. So you can see that this runs to 6 pages and it's got a number of notes and points and different categorizations within it. So you might think this might be overkill, but it was really helpful for us and the whole review team when we were doing our screening. And I've just taken a screenshot of the first page here of that eligibility criteria. So you can see that in terms of the population, we were looking at individuals, households, communities living or working in areas, coastal areas in Southeast Asia. So we had to define what countries were in Southeast Asia. So I literally had to go through and decide, well, there are several different definitions of what Southeast Asia is, the economic definition, the geographical definition. We also needed to define what coastal area was. So how do you define that? Some people might see it as, 100 or 200 meters from the beach. Maybe that's what an ecologist might determine a certain coastal zone as. But actually, we wanted to be a bit broader than that. So we define them as areas which are adjacent to and heavily dependent on or impacted by the sea. So that could be in economic, socio-cultural, or ecological terms. We also said that each of the studies must clearly state that they're focused on that relevant population. So you can start to see here how detailed we're getting with these eligibility criteria. And then when it came to the intervention, we had a number of different categories or subcategories. So just for those of you who are looking and have more time to look at this offline, this intervention was about marine management interventions. So we had to try and classify those into different types of marine management, because that, again, it's something that could be interpreted by different people in different ways. So I don't want to scare you, but it's more a point to just to say, please be as detailed as possible, and you're probably not going to realise the level of detail you need to go into when it comes to this. So this is a point where scoping and testing is really important. So in terms of how the process works, it generally gets undertaken at several different stages. So these can be title, abstract, and full text. So we've got those sort of 3 levels of information that any one study might give us, hopefully. And this helps us save time by consolidating the similar activities, and also by screening out at title stage. You sometimes are able to remove a large number of irrelevant titles if you are not able to do that by automated text mining methods. Typically, though, I would say a lot of the screening gets undertaken at title and abstract. And this, again, this will sometimes depend on what your tool or your software is that you're using and how it presents each of the records. So if it presents the title and abstract together, it's a lot easier just to screen titles and abstracts. So just screen the title first, and then if you can't make a decision from the title, then you screen at the abstract level. So often you'll have hopefully you'll have multiple reviewers doing screening. That's the most sort of objective way and the most reliable way of doing screening. You should be recording your reasons for exclusion. Now, I would say people can do this at title and abstract stage, but if you've got anything more than a few hundred results, then you're really going to be struggling to do this and manage your resources at the same time. So typically, just recording the reasons for exclusion at the full text level is sufficient. And it's typically included as an appendix in the supplementary information of any published evidence synthesis. So here's another one. What happens if I can't make a decision? So this is very typical. We often get people doing title screening and title and abstract screening exercises, and there's just maybes across the whole lot. Well, maybe, or I can't tell yet. So if you're screening at title or abstract stage, if you have any doubt about inclusion, you should be including that review. It might, if it's potentially relevant, even if the information is not provided, that's the moment at which you should be inclusive. And that's to reduce the risk of eliminating any non-relevant studies. Yeah, what happens if I can't make a decision at full text level? If there's not enough information, then you may need to go back and contact authors if possible. Again, it's all about being transparent at this stage. Okay, so we're going to have a go at screening some titles against some eligibility criteria. We'll use an example from, again, this was a real systematic review, but it's kind of slightly condensed a little bit. And that review question, how does the level of protection in a marine protected area affect populations of marine living organisms? Okay, so I'm now going to ask those of you who are in the meeting today to speak up, because I want some answers to this question. I'm going to ask you, can you identify the question components here? So the question components, this is a PICO question: population, intervention, comparator, and outcome. So would anybody like to tell me what the population is here?
It's all the marine living organisms, basically.
Yeah, absolutely right. Thanks, Valentina. All the marine living organisms, marine biota, as we said before. The intervention then?
Level of protection.
That's right. Yeah, thanks, Deborah. It's the level of protection in the marine protected areas. So what would the comparator be here?
Well, the level of protection.
Absolutely, yeah, thanks, Valentina. In this one, it's one of those reviews where there'll be different levels of protection. So you'll have, won't just be a no protection, it could be different levels. And finally, what's the outcome?
Can be density, can be, because it affects population. So density, life or death, or I don't know, something like this.
Yeah, absolutely right, Valentina. Affecting populations. So when we say populations, we mean the sort of the absolute numbers, density and things like that. So yeah, a little bit easier that one because we've already seen that one before, but thank you so much everyone for helping. And now let's move on to the exercise. I'm going to, so here we've got the inclusion criteria, and I'm going to put up 5 or 6, I think, different studies. Okay. And these are just the titles. So what I want you to do for the next few minutes, we'll give you, let's say, 4 minutes here, to look at each of these and decide whether you would include it or exclude it based on the title alone. So off you go. Okay, I'm going to open it up to you guys now. So who would like to tell me what your answer was for number 1? Was it include or exclude?
Exclude.
Exclude. Thanks, Peter. Yeah, so why did you exclude that one?
Because Nepal doesn't have a coastline.
Excellent. Thank you. So that's number 1. It's the wrong population for that one. So if you were doing this at full text, you would write down no population. You could do if you wanted to as a reason at this stage, but for title stage, it's probably a little bit too much information. For the next one, number 2.
Same, wrong population, but in this case, because it's not marine biota is poverty, so it's probably human population.
Yeah, okay, so Valentina, you've excluded it on the basis that it's on human populations, which is a fair assessment. Now, did anyone else have a different opinion on that one?
Yeah, I would say maybe, but you'd have to go to the full text to see if they've included outcomes that are of interest beside poverty.
Yeah, I think that's what I'd probably say as well, Peter. It's a really good assessment. So, although it's only mentioned reducing poverty here, it may have also mentioned some of the biotic measurements. So I would say you're right. But the only other thing is that we are looking at temperate marine protected areas, and these ones mention Costa Rica and Thailand, which are tropical. So probably on that I would exclude. So it is quite useful to actually know what reasons we're excluding on. So thanks both of you. Excellent. For the next one, number 3.
I can go again. I see no reason to reject this. It's marine reserves. Doesn't say anything about where it is. Yeah, accept.
Yeah, I would accept that one as well. Definitely, that looks like a pretty spot on from the title only. So we'll take that through to abstract and full text. The next one, number 4.
Well, for this one, I would probably go to read the abstract because I don't actually understand what it's about just from the title.
Yeah.
I work in Africa, so I know Zambia is landlocked. So I'd reject it on population.
Great. Absolutely. It's a bit like the previous.
Okay, cool.
One. Yeah. Thanks, Peter. Yeah, you're probably not the only one. You got that a little bit wrong there, Valentina. When looking at these, sometimes we do need to have a map, geographical map up, just to make sure that we know what we're doing. So yeah, excluding from the wrong population. But otherwise, I would say that's a very good point. Again, not really being sure as to whether they've got the right outcomes. So number 5.
I've worked with this person, so I know what this paper is about. But yes, you'd reject this. It's not about marine ecosystems at all. It's about terrestrial organic farming systems.
Yeah, I would say.
Yeah, for me, it was rejected too, because I mean, organic farming, well, I don't think that is the right population.
Yeah, it's not a protected area. So yeah, exclude on those bases. And it's a really good point, actually, Peter, that you bring up Sometimes we do come across studies which are written by colleagues, people that we know, or even ourselves sometimes. If that does happen, we tend to say, okay, let's, for those ones, we need to get somebody else to do the assessment on it, because we don't really tend to review our own work in terms of eligibility. And finally, number 6.
Included. I don't see any reason why to exclude this one. Marine reserve, Canary Island, perfect.
Yeah, it looks good. It looks good on the face of things. One thing I would say is about, again, it's about the temperateness of the Canary Islands. So they're a Mediterranean climate, but in this case, we're not sure whether, we're only told that we have to include temperate marine protected areas. So in some classifications, people group just temperate and tropical boreal into like really big groups of geographical zones. So if those are the zones that we're talking about, then yeah, I would say that this is probably in the more temperate zone. But if you're classifying them in a much more detailed way, so perhaps using the Köppen-Geiger classification system, these are going to sit separately to any of the temperate ones. And I've done a paper like this before where we had to define exactly what the kind of Köppen-Geiger temperate zones were, and I needed to make sure that I had a map with me every time I was doing my screening, so I needed to make sure that the particular location of that study was based in the right zone. So, well, I hope you found that exercise interesting, or a little bit fun, I guess. We are now going to do it another time, so I'm going to give it another go on a slightly different topic, though. So here's a systematic review question. What are the human well-being impacts of terrestrial protected areas? And let's go forwards to the actual exercise here. I'll give you a little bit less time, maybe a couple of minutes. So yeah, take it away. Here it is about population is humans living in or around a protected area. Your intervention is that protected area establishment or just presence of it. The comparator is a less protected or unprotected area, and your outcome is measures of human well-being. And again, we're including any empirical research.
Jacqui, there is a question on Slack. Why would you do the title and abstract screening separate? Is it not more efficient to screen it in the same time?
Yeah, really good question. Again, it depends on how you're seeing your. Okay, so it depends on two things. So first of all, it depends on what the tool is that you're using. So some tools don't allow you to see the title and abstract together. Most of them do, but some of them it's easier just to see the title. And so in that way, it can be quicker just to screen the titles first. And also, particularly when combined with the fact that in some reviews, and because of the way that some searching is undertaken or can only be undertaken for some topics, you might know that you're going to get quite a lot of irrelevant records that you're unable to screen out. Now, maybe text mining is going to help us with that a little bit more in the future. But if that does seem to be the case, that you're looking through and you're bringing up the abstracts, but it's not helpful, I would say, then just go to screening titles first. Typically, I would tend to do titles and abstracts together because that's the softwares that I use show them both. And I would say it is more efficient to do title and abstract together generally. I would say also just try it out and see how you get on, which method you prefer. For some reviews, I have gone and done titles first, very quickly looked through the titles. In fact, there's one review I'm doing at the moment, which I'm doing that. Just give it a few more seconds so people can finish these.
Jacqui, so far there are no further questions here on the platforms. Also, I've not seen something on the chat. If the participants maybe want to ask something, that would be great.
Yeah, do feel free to speak out at any point. Let's move forward. So who would like to tell me what they gave for number 7?
I can go. I would include this one. Human-related constraint, protected area management. Seems good.
Yeah, it's about humans, it's about protected areas. That's all we can tell for the title. So yeah, let's include it. Absolutely. Number 8.
I'm pretty sure it's not just Valentina and I on this call, so everybody else should try and pitch in. But I would include this.
Yeah, I would do the same. Include that one. Not quite sure exactly what it's about, but it certainly got relevant elements in there. Great. Number 9.
I would say no to this one. Because international trading CITES is species, protected species, but not protected area. So I would say no.
Yeah, it doesn't look relevant from first sight. However, I would probably say I would just include this one because it might be talking about the role of Thailand. So it might be talking about some protected areas within Thailand, or maybe Thailand's a designation of areas, reserves, which might be impacting the CITES reptiles and amphibians. There might be human well-being aspects in that as well, if it's talking about how people are exploiting animals. So I would say it's very unlikely to be relevant, but if you wanted to be really inclusive, you could include it at this stage. But I generally agree with you, Valentina. Number 10. Somebody else.
Okay, looks like it's me again. Reject this. This looks like it's some kind of paper about the genetics of wild canid species. I don't think it's about, doesn't seem to have any links to humans or human well-being, or even, well, the presuming Cerrado might be a protected area, but I think it fails on population and outcome probably.
Yeah, I would say the same. We've also got the next one, which is number 11, socio-economic impact of the Karoo National Park. Now, I would say that's probably an include. We've got national park, we've got protected area, we've got socio-economics. It's got to be talking about humans. So I'd say that was exclude. And then the final one, number 12. I think we could probably all say that one is going to be a definite exclude. That's not in our inclusion criteria. So let's move on. I've also got another screening exercise, which is looking at the abstracts, but I'm actually going to skip over that right now and just kind of move forward and talk about, in fact, no, we'll go there. So if you want to go to this link, I think Bibiana might be able to pop it into the chat as well. It's an OSF site, and it should take you straight to a page where there is a PDF document, which says ESMARConf 2023 Workshop 6 Screening. If you click on that, it should pop up, or it should pop up automatically, hopefully. So do let me know if you've got any problems accessing that. But again, I just want to give you about the same amount of time. You've got 4 abstracts in that document. And if you want to look at that document and trying to assess it on the basis of the same exclusion and inclusion criteria from before, so it's about human well-being and protected areas. Yeah, so just go to that one, and I will just put up the next slide will also have the same information. So you've got the website there, you've got your inclusion criteria, and you've got those 4 studies. So those are the titles. In fact, they are some of the ones that you've already looked at just in the last few minutes. I'm going to give you just a few more minutes, again, about the same amount of time, because you don't actually you can't really take your time about this. You've kind of got to move forward if you've got a lot of studies to get through. So it's really working out that trade-off between how much time you're spending on it and how accurate you're being. And of course, you're going to get way more efficient as you go along. So I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes to look at this now. Thanks, Bibiana, for posting the link. I'm not sure if you're able to do that on YouTube as well. It'll certainly be there after the live stream.
I've also shared it on Slack, so I think that we can be reaching more people there.
Okay, so that wasn't very long, but hopefully you got a good feel for some of those studies, and I'm pretty sure you all get very used to skim reading things. I certainly do, I think even more so since I've been working in systematic reviews. Right, so who would like to tell me what you thought of the abstract for Anita Patel? Include or exclude? Or not sure?
I think in general, I find it difficult to know if there's comparators in these from these abstracts. So for Anita, I thought it really doesn't sound like there's a comparator. It sounds like they're just focusing on describing a single protected area. Now, I don't know if you want to be conservative and say, but you need to check the full text to really understand if that comparator is there or not. So that's what I thought, yeah, it's about humans, it's a protected area. There's issues around human, yeah, I think human well-being probably. And it seems to be empirical research. So I think that's all fine. Just the comparative for that one.
I apologize. It seems that Jacqui has some technical issues. Okay, now she's back. Jacqui, you are muted.
Hi everyone, sorry about that. I just dropped out with my internet. It's raining here in the UK for a change. So I'm sorry about that. I managed to get to the stage where we decided that Peter had excluded the Anita study, included the Anita study. And I would say, I would also agree with you, Peter, to include if unsure, whether there is a comparator or not. Okay, let's move on to the next one, Baron A.
Jacqui, probably you could share your slides again. We are not seeing the abstracts. Thank you.
So who so hopefully you're seeing my screen now. We're back online. So who thought Baron A was an include?
Yeah, I thought it was similar to the previous paper in that they've looked at protected areas and the benefits to people. It's just unclear if there's a comparator in their analysis or not.
Yeah, I would say the same. Unclear if there's a comparator. Does mention undermanaged protected areas, so maybe that could be a comparator. I'm not sure if that would fall into our inclusion criteria, but we'd have to have a look. Thanks, Peter. The next one, Nijman. Well, this is the one which I said, let's be a bit inclusive about this, and it turned out, as I was almost certain, that it wasn't relevant. It's not about protected areas. I don't think there will be anything more about that in the full text, so I think we can exclude it at this stage. And then the article by Simon. Now, this one does look really relevant. It's about a national park, so we're assuming that it's protected. Sometimes some of these national parks can just be paper parks, but we're assuming that it's protected. Again, not entirely sure if there's a comparator. So it's a good point you've picked up, Peter. It's typically the comparator which isn't shown through in the abstract or the title. So yeah, definitely, if it's not there, I would include it, and just to look at it at full text, just in case, because we don't want to be overly exclusive. So, I mean, Any reflections on that process so far?
Jacqui, there is
Everything clear.
Jacqui, there is one question by Ismaila Salawu. Not about the exercise precisely, but the question is, sometimes in Africa, we do not have access to some journals because of subscription fees. What do we do if we include a study we can't have access to? What implications does it have for publication bias?
A really good question. I've actually got a slide about that later on, but we'll cover it now. Well, it's not a slide, it's just a prompt for me to answer that question. It can be really difficult to get access to a lot of papers. There are a number of methods that can be used. You can always ask the authors. If you can get hold of the authors from their email address, you can ask them for that. A lot of work is being published open access these days. You'll actually find that's quite encouraging, and preprints can also be like draft versions can also be made available by authors too. There's becoming a bit of a backlash against the paywall, so there's a number of ways in which people can help as well. There's a hashtag, a Twitter hashtag called CanHasPDF. So I think it's hashtag CanHazPDF. I think that's right. And that can sometimes help identify you, trying to find the PDF of a study. But it is a problem. If you've got collaborators working in different organizations on the same project, that can be also really helpful, because you can ask them to share some of the work that they're doing if you're working on the same project. So that's why international collaboration can be really useful and really important. Your library might also have an interlibrary loans section. That can be expensive, but it's one way of obtaining difficult to find studies as well. So I think one of my main reflections on this is that there's a huge variability in what people determine as relevant and not relevant, particularly when your inclusion criteria aren't very well defined. So that makes a really good case for trying to define them a bit further. But sometimes you just don't know and you have to go to the next level to find out. So some key things to remember. If you're uncertain, retain the record. It's easier to apply if your inclusion criteria, if they're well defined. So as I mentioned, some of mine have been defined to the nth degree. The other important thing is to avoid vague terminology, or at least if you're using terminology, to explain exactly what you mean by that. So we said by marine management interventions, we explicitly listed, and we had some examples of the types of marine management interventions we were interested in. You should be trialing your eligibility criteria, and that trial should involve everybody who's going to be carrying on doing that systematic review screening process. And again, recording and reporting in the final review is really important. Here's a question that also comes up quite a lot. So what about how many reviewers do I need to include in my evidence synthesis? Do I actually need multiple reviewers? I've only got myself. Sometimes if you're working on your own project, PhD students sometimes don't have access to a lot of people to help them. It can be a problem. So one thing that you can do if you're struggling for people is to sort of work share. So there's you can do this informally with your colleagues, where you help them out on one review and you might and then they can help them out on another one, help you out on another one. There's also a task share kind of forum, I suppose, or group which you can access. There's one which runs through the Cochrane collaboration, so I'm not sure if that's relevant for many people, but if you want to go and look for Cochrane collaboration and task share, there's a number of ways you can share work in that way. How many reviewers do we actually need? Well, I would say a minimum of 2 if you're going to be doing double screening or consistency checking. So it's also very useful to have a wide breadth of experience in your review team when you're doing screening. So topic expert is obviously really useful, but sometimes a methodology expert can be useful as well. Perhaps your topic is spreading across many different themes, and in that case, you might need somebody for each of the themes. So it really depends on the type of project.
Jacqui, there is a question on Slack. Peter Stewart asks, any wisdom on free tools for automating the title abstract screening process?
Oh, that's a really good question. I will go through tools at the very end, but I would say automating title and abstract selection is a very dangerous process to do if you're going to rely on it completely. I would say there are definitely some ways in which the tools have been developed with this in mind. And so I wouldn't necessarily try and develop or use a tool which completely screens out all of the studies at title and abstract level, because I would want to go back and check. There's a few which do a ranking, which I find quite useful. One of those is SysRev, and I'll talk about it in the next at the end of the session. And there's also there's a couple of others, but I'll get into those later. Right, okay, so we know that we're going to get differences between reviewers, so we do need to assess the level of agreement. And you can do this using a consistency test. And then if there is disagreement, you can refine your definitions and repeat the assessment. So you can do this with a consistency, like a test, which I'll show you one in the next few slides. But probably one of the best ways to do this is literally to sit down with people in the same room, or to get together after a certain number of screening records, double screening or triple screening records, and having a discussion about the reasons for differences. And that process should, of course, be recorded and tested and scoped. Put a slide in here for any questions, in case anybody's not quite holding on with us at the moment. But I want to just cover quickly consistency checks. So these are really important. So you're going to have multiple reviewers in your study. And even if you're not having multiple reviewers and you don't have the time, that's not recommended, but if that's all you can do, you should also be consistency checking across the time period that you are screening. And that's to minimize the risk of this decision drift. So it can also be really fun by doing consistency checks. I did a recent review once where prizes for those who were getting through the screenings and having the lowest consistency problems with consistency. Keeping notes regularly, discussing. We tend to do a 10% sample as a very minimum, but this is, I would say it's a minimum, and I would repeat this across the process, perhaps 2 or 3 times. It depends on the scale and the size of your review, of course. So one of the tests for consistency, which is often talked about, is the Cohen's-Kappa test. I'm going to flip through this quickly because I want to get on and talk about things like tools and give a chance for people to discuss this. So the Cohen's-Kappa is a measure of this inter-rater or inter-reviewer agreement level. It basically, in a nutshell, it tries to assess the proportion of agreement after an element of chance has been removed. This is the calculation for it. You can find plenty of information about it online, and some tools that will help you calculate it as well. So typically this is what you would have if you've got, say, 2 reviewers, and you can do this with a slightly different version of this test with more than 2 reviewers. So you've got the includes and excludes by both reviewers. So where both reviewers agree to include, both agree to exclude, one agrees to include and exclude, and vice versa. And at the bottom here, you can see there's a sort of like a table of interpretation of the kappa value. So if your kappa value is, in this case, it's falling at 0.5649, it falls within the moderate agreement level. Now, sometimes Cohen's kappa can be a little bit misleading. And this is particularly the case when you have rare categories where you have, you're mostly agreeing on some studies, but then there were some which were only a few, say like 5 or 10%, which you disagreed on. And in these cases, the kappa can underestimate the agreement on that rare category. And this is due to the way that the statistic is calculated, the difference in quantity and allocation between these different boxes that we just saw in the last slide. It's typically, and sometimes can be considered, a overly conservative measure of agreement. Other ways of measuring this are percentage agreement on particular, how many you agree to include or exclude. And there are a number of other alternatives as well. There's Scott's pi, which I haven't used, Fleischer's kappa. This is to be used when you've got multiple reviewers, not just two. But you can also use weighted kappas as well. What I would say is any of these tools are just indications of agreement levels, and you can use them. I'd certainly say it's better to use them than not use them, but also use it alongside your own sort of sensible judgment. Typically, if you are repeating your consistency checks across the course of your project, you'll be able to get a good feel for how much decision drift there is or how much difference there is between reviewers. And you can adjust and talk and provide more detail on the inclusion criteria according to that.
Jacqui, there is a question on Slack. At which stage would you test for inter-rater reliability? I can imagine results will be different in title screening compared to full text screening.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's take title and abstract screening together, because that's typically what's done. You would do them at both stages. So you'll do it both at the title and abstract stage and the full text stage. That's really important. So yeah, you've got to do it at any stage that you're doing the screening. So you might be really confused now. What am I going to do? I don't know how many reviewers I've got. If I do have lots of reviewers, I don't know how I'm going to record all of this or to overcome this potential selection bias. Well, just remember that everything you're doing in one of these evidence syntheses, if you're recording it, you're already doing a lot better than any other review type. So it's all about transparency. I would say just keep rechecking all the way throughout, keep taking a random sample. And that's another really important point, is that when you're doing your sampling, so say you're going to sample 10% of your studies at the very beginning, you need to do that randomly if you're doing a consistency check between different people, because if not, if you're doing it by author, for example, you're just taking the first chunk that appear in, first 10% that appear in your list of records. You might be getting a load of them that are undertaken by a few authors, and that's not a random sample of your full data set. So just running through the next part is about how to document what you're doing here. So you might be familiar with flowcharts. Here's one example. And we've also got the example of the roses in the next one. Just to mention here, this is also where articles and studies delineate. So where you might have multiple articles in one study or multiple studies in one article. And that's a really important definition to make, which will fall out when you do the sort of later bit of screening and data coding and data extraction. This is the roses flowchart setup. So many different ones that you can use. This is one which was developed for collaboration for environmental evidence and their syntheses. And just a note about full text screening, it will need to follow the same principles as the title and abstract screening. So that's in terms of doing the consistency checking, making sure you're using the inclusion exclusion criteria fully. But also to mention that sometimes you can find that actually when you're doing the screening at full text, you're reading the full article. This might be the most efficient point at which to do your coding. So that's where you're taking variables, information out of your each of the studies and recording it perhaps in an Excel sheet or something. So just wanted to make sure that people are aware that this can be a really efficient way of doing your coding, doing it at the same time as screening. So we've had this question already about not being able to find or access a full text. ResearchGate can be another really useful source of studies. Sometimes I would find that actually I've had a really good response rate from authors by asking them really nicely in emails. So now that we typically get email addresses with the publications of papers, it's an opportunity for you to request information from authors. And this also leads into the kind of the coding and data extraction. I've often found typically that there's not enough information in a lot of the studies I'm looking at. And I've sent well-structured but copied and pasted parts, emails to authors, and I've had a really good response rate. So if you're asking nicely, if you're saying what you're doing it for, and also that if they're going to help you, they would get a citation of their study, that can really help you. So other common pitfalls here, these are quite sort of practical ones. So not taking regular breaks when screening. So this can lead to decision fatigue, where you kind of get a little bit sloppy in terms of your decision making when you're screening. It can also really burn you out and make you demotivated on the project, particularly when you've got a lot to do. And it also leads to decision drift. So that's one of the common pitfalls. Do make sure that you kind of structure your screening, and it's good to do it in chunks, but not too big chunks. So you'll find out what your own tolerance levels are. Trying to code in too much detail. So this might be when you're just making decisions. And so, for example, at the full text level, try not to put too much information in there because it's only going to slow you down. But do make sure you get some as well. This is something that often happens, and it means that you might need to go back and re-screen some of your studies. It's when you miss potentially relevant or potentially interesting studies. And I say potentially or sideline because these studies might not have been anticipated when you first started doing your review. And it might be that you've suddenly realized you've got a whole chunk of studies. I've got this happening in a review that I'm doing at the moment. I've got a whole chunk of studies that I'm interested in, but I don't think they're quite relevant. What I've done is I've tagged them. So I've said these studies are included, but I've got another column in my Excel sheet where I'm saying, okay, we're tagging these because they are on a particular topic, or perhaps they're undertaken in a geographical location which isn't relevant to your review, but there's a lot of them. You might want to include them as a separate group to come back to if you have enough time, or if you've not got enough studies in your full review. And again, that's perfectly fine. It's just a case of recording that. What else did I want to say about that? Can't remember. So yeah, not keeping track of your consistency or not keeping track of anything is a really common pitfall, and I found that out to my own detriment. So do try and make things rather than repetitive and tiring, more fun and competitive. Again, as I said, I've done this where I've given prizes to people for doing various different screening. Minimize the amount of detail to record, and tag interesting articles. Those are some key things. So in summary, about this part of the screening, before we move on to the tools, we've seen that we should be using these really well-defined eligibility criteria for efficiency, transparency, and repeatability. And we know that there's going to be a degree of decision difference between reviewers. Your aim is to reduce this, and for any situation in which there might be difference in decision, that the authors should be more inclusive than exclusive, and that will account for that difference in decisions. We've talked about assessing for repeatability and checking criteria, documenting everything using flowcharts, and keeping a detailed record of any reasons for exclusion. So I just want to finish off by talking about softwares now. So there's lots of different softwares to manage articles. I don't know if anyone's looked at the systematic review toolbox, aimed at systematic reviews, but relevant to many evidence syntheses. And you can go on this and search for tools that you want to, the stage of review that you want to look at. If you look at screening, there are tens of tools that are available. So let's start off with Excel and other spreadsheets. They can be quite easy to use. Many people are already familiar with them. So if you've got a multiple review team, then it can be, it's quite easy because they already know how to use it. They can be clunky though. They're not designed specifically for doing evidence syntheses, but generally they're inexpensive. They don't cost anything. You can also use reference management software, so things like EndNote, Zotero, Mendeley. These can be really useful, and I know some of the searching group like to use reference management softwares when it comes to screening as well. These also can be quite easy to use once you're used to the system, but they can be expensive, and it might be that different reviewers on your team prefer to use different reference management software. So some are really some people who use EndNote are really anti-Mendeley, for example. So that can cause a bit of friction. But then there are review management software. So we've got things like Covidence, EpiReviewer, Kadima, Sysrev, Ryan. These are all specifically designed for the purpose of undertaking reviews. However, they can be expensive. And that's a very brief sort of overview of what those ones are. Let's look a little bit more at a couple of these. So I would say that EpiReviewer is one of the ones which has quite a good bit of functionality. It was designed by a group of researchers in the UK, and it does a lot of different things. One of the good things about it is they have a fantastic support and help desk. They are very quick at getting back to you with any problems. You can always access your review, so even though you might not be subscribed, you can still get back to it. And it's relatively inexpensive. So that's one worth checking out. There's also a completely free one. This is called Kadima. This was developed by the wider Collaboration for Environmental Evidence Network. That's one of the networks who produce guidelines for systematic reviews in environmental syntheses. It's also based on the EpiReviewer model, but it's slightly tweaked and designed a bit differently. So that's also one worth checking out, particularly for those who want access to the full the full software without having to go just to a limited free version. So I would also recommend having a look on Systematic Review Toolbox. I've picked out a few of the ones that I've used personally before here. All of them have got their pros and cons, and I'm unable to kind of go through those with you right now because there's quite a lot of them. But I would say that some of the recent ones I've used are, well, Sysrev I've used, is the most recent one that I've used. It is freely available. I don't know if you have to pay for it. I don't know if there is a paid version. I've not paid for it, if that is the case. But it's got good functionality. You can use it on your phone. It's quite easy to use on your phone. I think there's an app for at least a couple of these. I can't remember if Sysrev's got an app, but Ryan does. So it's been quite useful when I've been actually sitting on a train or something. I've been able to just go through and use these tools and screen quite easily. Ryan has been useful. There's a bit of a quirk in the way that it exports some of its data. I'm not sure if that's been sorted out. I know they've had a recent update and revamp, so there may have been some changes there. And a lot of these have free trials. So Covidence, for example, that is quite an expensive one, but I've used it with on some commercial reviews that I've done, and it's been pretty useful actually. But for example, this one for Covidence, for a single review, it's $240 per year. Ryan, for example, one of the cheaper options to go for is $4 per month for students. And for professionals, it's about $8 per month. So there's a big variability in the price that's available. What do I want to say other about these? But yeah, so a lot of them are using either machine learning or text mining. I think mostly machine learning. So for example, with Sysrev, it uses, and I think with Ryan as well, it has a ranking system. So it uses machine learning to determine, based on these studies, the titles and abstracts that you're looking at, which are most likely to be more relevant, and then it pushes them up in the list of review of studies to be assessed. So that I find is quite a useful tool. And as I've mentioned, these are becoming more and more available. We've seen that actually by using machine learning or building it in to tools for systematic reviews, the cost of, there was one study which worked out that the cost of a review could be potentially halved or even less than halved by using single screening with text mining as compared to double screening. So there's a lot of opportunity there. And just to also shout out to Martin Westgate's GitHub Rev Tools. This is a package for article screening. I do believe it uses some text mining or text analysis. And there are plenty more talks on the more technical aspects of text mining used for screening and text mining itself on the ESMARConf website if you want to go and have a look at those. Some of them have been presented in previous years. So all that remains for me is to say thank you and to field any questions before we need to sign off. So do feel free to ask any questions.
Jacqui, there are so far no questions on Slack, Twitter, YouTube, here in the chat. Okay, so there is one question on Slack now. One eligibility criterion is language. Not all studies are published in English. In my experience, translating documents from German, French, Russian, Spanish, Korean, or Chinese to English using Google Translate works fine. In principle, would you recommend collecting and screening non-English documents as well as English documents, although this certainly depends on the purpose of one's research?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. It really does depend on the research that you're undertaking, that topic area. If you think that it's likely that there's going to be a large suite of studies written in a particular language, I would say, yes, go for it. But otherwise, we typically tend to only search in English and only look for studies in another language if there's a good reason for it, and that's perfectly justifiable in the write-up of a review.
Okay, so I think that we are all set and the questions have been answered successfully.
Great, thanks so much.
Okay, thanks. Thank you to you, Jacqui. So that's it for today's workshop on screening studies for eligibility in evidence synthesis. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Thanks so much, Jacqui, for this wonderful workshop. We learned a lot. And see you all soon at the next session.